Welcome. Okay, so what is this video? Why is this video? Basically, I'm going to be talking about a documentary from 2009 called Special When Lit. And it's all about pinball, history of pinball, and for the time, sort of the contemporary pinball community in the United States. And yeah, this isn't really the kind of thing that I typically talk about on the channel, although I think eventually you'll see how it does ultimately relate to plenty of stuff that I've talked about before. But right here at the front, I just want to communicate that you should probably watch this documentary. It's free on YouTube. Even if you're not interested in pinball in the least, this is a really good documentary. But maybe for unintentional reasons, because at least in my opinion, some of the stuff they capture here is really like beautiful and vulnerable a lot of the time for reasons that I'll get into soon enough. But it really just caught me off guard just how well this seemingly pretty low budget documentary struck me, how much it affected me to watch this. And a big part of that is because it's providing a window into a community that I know next to nothing about.
Once you get the lure of the silver ball in you, it's like an addiction and you just can't stop. And I just kept, it's like you got to have them all.
And it also just highlights some really fascinating characters, just individuals who, I don't know, just happen to share things on camera that are indeed very vulnerable. You could even consider it oversharing at certain points. Anyway, that's the general idea of what I'm going to be talking about here. Okay, let's get started. As I've already alluded to in the intro, I did not know what I was getting into, and even from the first few shots, I had the sense that this was not some kind of big, high production value type of movie. Even just some of the shots they lead with, you just think, okay, some color grading really could have made these look better, or just shot selection isn't that great. Even like the typeface they use on screen to, give people credits and things. Yeah, it's okay, and I'm not trying to bash the doc in any way, of course. And in fact, it's because of this general sense of, I hope this doesn't sound too mean, but a general feel of like amateurish filmmaking or just sort of DIY to a certain extent. They're just getting whatever footage they can. They're getting interviews with as many people as possible, putting it together into a documentary that clearly pays a lot of respect to the contemporary pinballing community. And the first big thing I want to highlight here, and one of my favorite aspects of the documentary, and a big part of what's motivated me to talk about it here on the channel, is that this documentary manages to do something that plenty of reality TV shows and even just more professional documentaries rarely accomplish, which is to give an honest and mostly unfiltered look at a small community and also into the lives of just specific members of that community. So, big disclaimer up front. Some of the clips you're gonna see here from the doc, they might potentially fall into the category of, being a little bit cringy to some people. They might seem very specific, geeky. I am not trying to communicate that. I am not trying to put this stuff out there to make fun of anybody. I'm not mocking the documentary itself. I'm not mocking the people who are involved in it. Just the opposite. In fact, I think it's really fantastic that they were able to get a bunch of footage and interviews with people who are clearly not super familiar with being on camera, who are not super self-conscious in most cases about being on camera. They're just straight up being really honest about a passion of theirs. In general, myself and plenty of other people just love hearing other people talk about something that they really, really deeply enjoy. And at times in these kinds of conversations or interviews, those people might end up revealing a lot more about themselves than you kind of bargained for. They might just share, more intimate details about their lives, their personalities or something, which just adds to the interest for me. And this is something that happens outside of documentary filmmaking as well. If you've been watching the channel for a while, you might have seen a video I did on the Studs Terkel book, Working. So Studs Terkel was a guy who went around and just interviewed people basically for a career, compile those interviews into books on various topics. And Working, obviously, is a book where he interviews tons and tons of people about their jobs, about their careers. concepts of work, etc. It's really fantastic. Go ahead and read it. Something that really kind of shocked me going through that book for the first time was just how articulate and interesting a lot of these people could be. And once again, these are mostly not people who are public figures in any way. These are not people who are used to being recorded. And I think in the introduction to that book, Stud Sterkel himself notes that when you just sit down and start listening to someone, they're probably going to just share a lot with you. In fact, they'll probably share more than what you ask for, which is what I was just talking about with some of the interviews that come up in Special When Lit, is that people just like having the opportunity to talk, and especially if they don't have a lot of other outlets in their life where they can share their passion for a certain hobby or just their thoughts on a certain topic, they'll often be very enthusiastic to do so. I mean, it applies to myself too. I mean, that's part of why I have the channel at all, is that there are certain topics that I don't often get to talk about in my everyday life, but having an outlet to do that where anybody at all happens to listen to me is just really exciting. It's a great motivator. And yeah, in these scenarios, when you're interviewing people for whatever kind of project, you might get these instances where they're just like, you know what, just thanks for listening. Thank you for listening to me. I'm happy to be here and I just want to share some stuff. And that happens so much in Special When Lit. It's kind of shocking. I'll be showing some clips of sort of some of my highlights from the movie. First, I just want to say that, again, that kind of feel, like this really authentic feel to a lot of these interviews, is so different. It's in very stark contrast to stuff that you'll see, especially in something like reality TV, which, as we all know, despite the name, isn't at all real. Like, yes, it's real people, but these are people who have been carefully chosen for the show. They're most often very conventionally attractive people. A lot of them are like models or aspiring actors. They're people who have already been on screen, people who are very comfortable on screen, maybe too comfortable at times. They know their angles, they know what they're supposed to be doing there, and they're being coached very heavily by the production teams behind those shows. Over here in low-budget documentary land, we get the complete opposite. I really do appreciate that we're just talking to people. We're just talking to people who really care about the topic at hand, and as a result, they're willing to share so much. Hopefully, kind of briefly here, I can share some of my favorite sort of characters from this documentary and just some fantastic clips from their interviews. So the first one is a guy called Sam Harvey. Basically, he's just a massive, extremely dedicated collector of pinball machines, and not just the machines themselves, but also records of scorecards from different games, parts. He'll repair and refurbish a lot of stuff. He apparently keeps all this stuff just in his house. I find Sam really likable.
I was blessed with an unbelievable memory. I mean, records, pinballs, jokes. Did you hear about the Polish carpoolers? They all met at work.
Sam just so perfectly articulates just like the purity, I guess, of his interest in pinball. He just enjoys doing it. He enjoys like every facet of the world of pinball and every aspect of the machines themselves.
The rush of being able to play any game you have at any given time by just pushing the button is, you can't explain it to people. You know, it's something that you like and it's fun and it's enjoyable. Isn't that awesome?
And then Sam goes on to share certain things that aren't really related to pinball much at all, maybe just tangentially. And on top of that, the filmmakers made the decision to include all this. I don't know. Were they padding for time? Did they just think, oh, this was a nice little thing he said, let's throw it in there, even though it's not super related? Regardless, I'm really happy those segments of the interview are here, and I just want to share like a couple of those with you here in the video as well.
My mom and my real dad got married and divorced twice, and they say it's kind of hereditary, but my real dad smoked and drank, and he was an alcoholic, and I never did drink or smoke, so I get high on life, not on anything artificial.
Our next big character is a guy called Rick Stetta, and this guy is basically really well known for being more or less the first like official world champion pinball player. He's a tournament player. We have some old sort of archival footage of Rick playing different games in his house, I guess. But on top of that, we get these lovely interview clips with him from back when this documentary was being produced.
Nobody thought that much of me, you know. They thought, I was pretty much, just some weird guy that was out doing stuff by himself.
Maybe people would have different interpretations of certain things that he's saying here, different reactions to certain sentiments that he shares here. But at least for me, it's, again, just an example of an incredibly honest interview. He's just saying things that he really, really feels in his heart of hearts, and the result is fantastic.
Pinball makes me feel very special because I have pinball as my own world, always something that's there for me.
The last specific individual that I want to mention here who's featured pretty heavily in this documentary is a guy called Josh Kaplan, but he's better known in this community as Pin Geek. As far as I know, the dude is still around. You can see his website here. He has a YouTube channel over here where he still seems to be uploading stuff. I guess he originally specialized in just taking like handycam video of people playing pinball. He would just take video of the boards and put it onto DVDs and sell those. And he admits that this is just kind of like a janky little business model. He's like, people like it.
I'm not a businessman. I'm just a hack carrying around a camcorder.
This is what the dude does. He seems to be really into it, and he gets a lot of screen time in this documentary. I guess he's sort of seen as like a somewhat controversial figure in the pinball community.
I'm the Jim Morrison of pinball. They either love me or hate me.
He's someone who, in these interviews for the documentary, starts going off into more personal stuff every once in a while, and I'll leave the interpretation of those comments up to other people.
I'm Elton John at a baseball stadium by the show or something that I can go in a glitter outfit, and guess what my ride is? It's this hot chick in leather pants, and I'm on a Harley, and in the back, she drops me off. And she goes, "You're a pin geek?" And I go, "Yeah." Elton John was the ultimate showman in the 70s, and I want to be like him. I want to be a showman. You know, everybody tells me what to do. Everybody tells me to take these drugs, I should be in an institution. People need to slow down and get back to basics here and talk to each other. And, you know, there might not be all this fighting and war and shooting. And, you know, whatever happened to just going into a bar like John Wayne, you know, somebody said something to you, punch him out, and then you have a drink over it later.
But just at surface level, yeah, he does seem to be someone who has made this basically his life, like the majority of his life, and he doesn't seem to really have any big issues with that. It doesn't seem to bother him either that it's sort of led to a somewhat isolated life as well.
If you met the right woman, would you give up pinball for her?
Absolutely not.
I guess it will depend on what type of woman it is.
But to close out here, I want to get into the second major aspect, the second major component, I guess, of why I think this is actually a pretty special documentary. And this is the side of things where the documentary attempts to cover the sort of inevitable fact that the pinball community is inherently dying out because the popularity of the machines has nosedived more or less since the 80s. There was a slight resurgence in the early 90s after the video game crash. But since then, for pretty obvious reasons, other forms of entertainment, and especially home entertainment, have just completely taken over. And plenty of people just aren't super familiar with pinball anymore. That's not their fault. It's just not around many places anymore. They're very expensive to produce. They're very expensive to purchase and maintain, etc. The documentary would have felt lacking, I suppose, if it hadn't at least touched on this topic. And more than that, they decided to dedicate basically the last leg of the entire documentary to sort of the sad reality that, yeah, at some point the entire community is basically going to be completely wiped out, which is really sad, like regardless of whatever community you happen to be talking about. Like, this is just a bunch of people not hurting anybody, just having a great time, really passionate about this particular type of game. I really do enjoy looking into communities that I'm not really personally familiar with. And it's definitely not just me, because lots of other YouTubers have done this kind of work in the past. I mean, Jenny Nicholson did a whole thing on the Bronies that was excellent. Other people have talked about like specific Tumblr fandoms, things like that. I even did a video on sort of the synth and gear sub-community here on YouTube. Yeah, looking into a community that you're not necessarily a part of yourself can be just incredibly fascinating. In fact, I even think it's a feeling that was captured really well in that Christopher Guest movie Mascot, where like a lot of the humor just comes from the fact that the average person might not think there's a big community or a lot of passion behind this one hobby, this one type of performance, whatever, but there really is. And to an outsider, it can be kind of shocking, and it can also just be fun to sort of feed off the energy of that community and maybe even get into it yourself. And then when we start talking about these smaller sub-communities that are actively dying off, that just adds a whole new dimension to media covering these communities. And one of the final points I want to make here is that if you're just someone who watches this documentary and you're not super into pinball yourself, then there might be certain elements towards the end of the doc that seem sort of, I don't know, slightly abrasive or maybe even ignorant to a certain degree. And it's when a lot of the people they're interviewing from the pinball community start talking about video games. And for the most part, they tend to say very negative things about how video games measure up to pinball.
What can you do in a video game? You can't see anything except what's on the screen.
A video game, I got to the end, I finished it. It took me, 42 months and 10 hours a day, but I finished the game. It is now done. Pinball machine, you're never done.
As someone who's really into video games, even I felt that sort of tug of, well, that's not quite right, or he's kind of stretching the truth here to make his point. Then I remembered a really fantastic idea that was presented by Tantacruel in his recent video on musical elitism. When you hear a small community of people talking about like, oh, I really only like the old stuff, or they're really resistant to change in their community, to someone outside of that, it might sound overly defensive. It might sound sort of hostile to changes and kind of silly to take a big stance there. But in reality, it's probably a group of people expressing concern and maybe even fear over the potential or inevitable loss of something that they really, really value. They value this community, and if they feel like it's pushing them out, or if they feel like it's dying off because of some hostile outside force, of course they're going to respond that way. Of course they're going to try to argue against the thing that is having a detrimental effect on their community. Did video games come along maliciously to like destroy physical and electromechanical games and things like that? No, of course not. Like, it was just another form of entertainment. It happened to be very successful. It has continued to be very successful in different iterations. That's fine. But at the same time, even as an outsider here, I can look at this pinball community and I can feel just really sad for them.
It took me quite a few years after we closed the arcade to I had a pretty big lung funk. Just the daily interaction of the world that I had at my doorstep that I knew I was never going to have again.
I think one of the most difficult things that anybody might encounter in their lives is to be somewhat helpless in the inevitability of an outcome.
And I kind of liken it to when a small business in your neighborhood closes down. Even if you'd never been there before, even if you didn't especially like it, seeing it gone can still have a really negative effect, and it really makes it feel like the neighborhood itself has changed in some way. And those are certainly some of the comments that we start to get at the tail end of this doc, is that people are just kind of sad. They sort of just sound defeated a lot of the time. In fact, some of them even just admit, yeah, if pinball died off completely, it wouldn't really matter on an objective level to lose pinball. Like, life will go on. Still, they try to emphasize that there is something of value in this community, there's something of value in this particular type of game, and losing all of that is a net negative.
Were pinball not to survive, the world would continue, but a little bit of the fabric of life would be gone.
In fact, this type of documentary, and in other cases with other subject matter, might try to have some kind of call to action towards the end where they're like, hey, this is a way that you can contribute towards positive change. It ends on a nice positive note. We don't get that here. There's basically no call to action. One of the guys sort of encourages more people to try out pinball in a general sense, but outside of that, people just sound sad that it's ending and that they're starting to lose a community that they really, really just value as part of their lives. And then it just ends. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that decision from a filmmaking point of view, but as a viewer, I kind of appreciate it because it almost would have felt dishonest to try to spin everything in a really positive light there at the tail end. And going back to what we were saying earlier, it's honest. It's consistent with the tone of the documentary overall, which is that it doesn't really feel like they're manipulating all these interviews too much. It doesn't really feel like they're trying to push a certain agenda or message, which is very common in documentary filmmaking. No, they're kind of just showing people talking about their hobby. And there's something really straightforward and appealing about that to me. And yeah, that's ultimately why I wanted to talk about this small TV documentary. And I hope it's been an enjoyable trip for you. I hope I've done a decent job of articulating why I think it's a fascinating little movie. I hope that plenty of people will go ahead and check it out, have their own experiences with it, their own interpretations of what's happening and how it was all put together. But for the moment, that's all I've got. And I'll just say thanks for stopping by.
And just as I'm thinking, maybe I'm not going to do this, Pinball Wizard comes on the radio, and I thought, nope, I'm going. Phew, and it was like my longest haul. It was like, 26 hours later, I'm finally home, exhausted. Ended up coming home with 3 machines. They're up on this upper deck.